It's hard
several hundred.
to express or to give dimension. Here in the United States, we're used to some level of freedom of information and going around and doing our reporting. It's hard to explain how difficult was to actually do journalism in those years, in the years of the Chilean coup, but also the Argentine coup, at a time when Latin America was immersed in this right-wing dictatorships. Like Marcela or John, would you want to tell us a little bit what was it like to do journalism at the time?
Well, John was working at that time. You were founder of the APSI magazine, right?
Yes.
And I think that was one of the most successful projects of the media against the dictatorship. But many others were silenced. The journalists were persecuted and killed by the regime. I think it was a very risky, dangerous job at that time.
Well, no, I can tell you my experience. I was here for the first 5 years, and we created OPSI with great restrictions. It was permitted by the government on the condition that we only wrote about international affairs.
Yeah.
So it was called Actualidad Internacional,
Yeah.
International reality. So we would write about Brazil and the human rights movement in Brazil. We would write about the Jimmy Carter election in 1976, and then when he took power in 1977, and his human rights policy which was incredibly important for Latin America. We would write about those topics, but we couldn't write directly about Chile for the first 2 or 3 years. But I was able to publish, however, outside of Chile because I worked for the Washington Post and Time magazine. So many of the stories, for example, I wrote, I think, the first story documenting the phenomenon of the disappeared, the phenomenon which is a deliberate tactic of capturing people, putting them in secret prisons, executing them after torture, and then hiding their bodies, o sea, making them disappear. That tactic, that intentional tactic of killing people secretly, is what we call the tactic of disappearance, forced disappearance. And we didn't understand it at the time. The people in the human rights community didn't know what was going on. They thought that these people would eventually appear because no bodies were appearing. And sadly, during 1976, which I was able to publish in the Washington Post, evidence that was given to me by the human rights organization, the Vicaría de Solidaridad, and the Committee for Peace, that this was deliberate, that there were 5 cycles of disappearances, each of which had 30 or 40 people who had been captured and disappeared. And these people were never going to appear again. And that was the beginning of the understanding of this horrible tactic of disappearance. So that was one of my articles. I was able to write that because I traveled to Washington and I wrote the story in Washington. It never appeared in the Chilean press, as far as I can tell. But other articles that were not as sensitive that I wrote in the Washington Post, they would then be repeated in a small column called Chile Abroad, Chile en el Exterior, which El Mercurio would publish in this little column small summaries of articles that had appeared in the international press about Chile. So sometimes very important cases of human rights violations. They were able to publish them because they'd already been published abroad, but they wouldn't ever do the republishing. They wouldn't do the reporting themselves. So often sometimes the journalists would give me the details. So I would, so I would publish it in the
Mm.
Washington Post, and then it would appear in Chile in what they called the rebote, the bounce back.
Mhm.
That was
I would like to add two comments about this. One is that for people like me, I was born in 1971, so I was 1 year old at the moment of the coup. I grew up without information about these crimes. All the information that we had were rumors about people that was missing, for example, but nobody was sure that they were killed, for example. And it was very difficult to obtain information for us. People shared, as John uh, has said, people share some articles from foreign media, but not Chilean media. And there were some projects, very brave projects, like APSI, and also other magazines like Cause, Analysis, and others. And also there was a TV media project that was called Teleanalysis. And they elaborate a news program, a news report about the protests that start happening in Chile during the 80s, 1983. Uh,
1983.
yes, and they cover all these protests. They elaborate a program, and they tape it in a videotape, so we could see these videotapes in our homes, in our machines, VHS machines, but not in the open media, not on television. And I think this little windows to the truth were very important for us to understand the magnitude of the situation in Chile.
one
Yeah,
practice that
I was
John
here in
was discussing this
1983.
now before, and writing obliquely or writing kind of as an allegory about somewhere else, of what was happening somewhere else to reflect what was happening in your country, was a very common practice in Argentina too, as you were just mentioning, John. And sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Maybe I have a little bit of a lag, but you were going to say something, John.
Um, that's okay. I forgot what it was. It was some comment about something Marcellus had said.
One thing,
In a,
one thing that I find very interesting, and torture and the horror that spread through Latin America is like, it's hard to understand how much fear there was, for just basically communicating stuff, speaking out loud about what was going on, etc., etc. Much less publishing it. So it required a lot of um, courage, and even to pass information to reporters who were actually going to publish their stories in the news abroad. And I was wondering, like, those we call them fixers, etc., etc. What was their role at the time, John? And the people who brought you information, were they safe? Were they news people? Were they journalists? Were they just fixers? Were they random people you encounter on different moments in the street?
you mean you mean my sources?
Yeah.
It wasn't rocket science. You couldn't depend on the things that were published in the press uh, to a great extent. But I did have on human rights. I did have very good sources because Chile, I think, unlike Argentina, had a very important human rights organization that was sponsored by the Catholic Church, and so its offices um, were right next um, to the cathedral on the Plaza de Armas in downtown Santiago. The cardinal literally covered us with his cape. And although I wasn't obviously working for the Vicaria, it was almost my office. I mean, I was over there all the time, talking to people, gathering information, and the information was always reliable about what was happening in the field of human rights. They would pass me reports, for example, in which they would summarize the situation of how many people had been detained, how many people they thought were killed, and so that was really important. There was another element of coverage where there were open events, like the release of some political prisoners. So I could cover that pretty much the way ordinary journalists do. There would be a press conference. There would be information that would be revealed by the government. I could go to where the prisoners were being released, etc. That was pretty standard type journalism. But any investigative journalism, which was really what I was trying to do, I had to do it with the help of other people always. I mean, but my sources were in the Vicaria. There were other journalists, and to a certain extent, I talked to ordinary people, but ordinary people didn't know anything. They were kept in the dark as a matter of official policy. So very seldom were you able to do real, person on the street reporting.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah.
One of the big moments of revealing the truth was in 1978, when some people from the Vicaría de la Solidaridad that has mentioned John, they denounced it. They said that some bodies have been found at a small place called Lonquén. Many bodies of people that were disappeared. Uh, so the Vicaría de la Solidaridad organized a group of people to check the information, and among them there was a journalist, the director of the Hoy magazine, Abraham Santibáñez, that is a very experienced old journalist, Chilean journalist. So they went there with the media, um, with the professionals that could cover this information, and they published it. This was the first time that a group of bodies of these people disappeared was found. It was very hard to know that. And it's true what John says, that the most of the people, like me and other people, we were in the dark. And there is a very good novel written by Alejandro Zambra, Ways of Coming Back Home, Formas de Volver a Casa. And he tells that he was young, he lived in Santiago de Chile, and at his family, nobody said anything about this. They didn't talk about politics because they were afraid of the consequences.
John, Marcela, I wanted to ask you, what do you think we learned or we can learn from journalism those years, and what can we apply, and what have you applied of your practice done in those years today? Or what can we learn about the world, or what can we learn about Chile and the coup, and what can we apply today?
Many things. Many things, Pablo.
I always said that journalism in a dictatorship is possible, and the idea that I didn't feel intimidated and many of the journalists that I was with were very courageous. We didn't feel like we were going to be, you know, picked up in the street and tortured or anything like that. The limitations on what we did were not physical like that. The limitations were that we simply were not able to publish in Chile what we knew. And gradually, the media were able to open up really after 1983. 1983 was very important with that open protest movement. The secret police, DINA, had been dissolved in 1977 and replaced with another organization that was somewhat more under control, although they still were killing people. There very few disappeared after that period, but they still were killing and torturing people. But the ability to publish inside the country was very, very, it was not impossible. OI magazine, for example, it was very difficult, but it was partial. And so you could publish part of the story, but you had to be very careful how much detail you would put in it. I published in OI, I would come back to Chile to do my investigations for the book I was writing, and I would publish the story. When I would have something exclusive, I would publish in OI with the name Ramon Marzano. Ramon Marzano, he was my best friend, right? He was like the guy that protected me. And so I later found documents from inside the dictatorship in which they were saying, who is this guy Ramon Marzano that's publishing all this stuff about DINA, about the secret police in OI magazine? So I guess I was successful. They didn't detect who I was, but I could write in my own name outside the country, but in Chile I would write as Ramon Marzano.
And there's a lot of also, I mean, I don't know, that the use of pseudonym is one of the strategies, but there were, in fact, journalists who were disappeared. I mean, I'm thinking of the Argentine cases. There's at least
Yes.
Jacobo Timerman very famously tortured, and many others too, right? That they've been tortured. Are there famous cases in Chile in those years?
Jose Carrasco, I think.
Sí. Jose Carrasco.
And Rodrigo Rojas de Negri, who was a photographer.
Yeah, he was. Yeah.
He wasn't a media guy, but he was trying to take images from a protest and he was killed. He was incinerated. He was
burned to death. Right.
Burned to death. Yeah.
I mean, there weren't very many. Carrasco was the most famous case, and that was in reprisal for the attack against Pinochet. It really wasn't because of his work as a journalist as such. He was also a political person. There were. I don't know of any cases where journalists were expelled from the country. They were arrested, and they were persecuted to a certain extent. Whenever I was in Chile, I knew that I was under surveillance. So the control was very strong. And at one point they tried to expel me from the country, and the embassy protested, and I was able to stay. So the measures against journalists were very strong, but they weren't total. And I never felt like I was going to be killed, or I measured the risk, and the other journalists, we all measured the risk to see to what extent we can function and what can we do. That was the game. You had to decide how much you can get away with, and then go ahead and do it.
Was it also possible that because you were American, you had more, you were less exposed, let's say, to the government? I mean, disappearing an American journalist would have been like an affront, right?
Get closer to your mic, Pablo.
Yeah, I was wondering if it was because also you were an American journalist and you were a little bit, you had at least the
See,
the embassy behind you.
yes, there's a siren going on. I hope you can still hear me.
Yeah.
I had a certain, I mean, mainly my protection was that I was publishing outside the country. Obviously, I mean, the other journalists, the Chilean journalists, were operating in the same conditions as me, but it was very difficult for them to publish. But it wasn't that they were like picking up Chilean journalists and not picking me up. Generally, the control was not, arresting people. We understood that there were certain things you could get away with, and very much that you couldn't get away with.
There was censorship also. They read the magazines before they went to print, and sometimes stopped the printing process. They
Confiscated them or
couldn't, you couldn't publish some issues, some magazines,
Some,
some
yeah, exactly. It was censorship. I mean, I mean, OPSI, we had to present every issue, and they would basically go through it, and they would cut out paragraphs. That was in the early days. And by the mid 1980s, there was much less of that. But still, it was very very restricted. There's a famous case of that I covered of Carmelo Soria. He was he was a Spanish man who worked for the United Nations. So you would think that he would have had some protection too. Well, he was also involved with the Communist Party, and they decided, they captured him, tortured him, and killed him. And the news reports about this international official who had been killed. His body had been found. It was faked as an auto accident. The news filtered out over a period of weeks, always very inaccurate, with partial little bits and deep pieces of real information. And I was able to do an investigation based on the autopsy and eyewitnesses. And I wrote the whole story that was published in the Washington Post. And then, only then, and that was like 2 months later, did the details come back to Chile through my story. So there were like 6 or 7 articles written about the case. All of them were pretty much impossible to understand. You wouldn't have known what was going on. You would have thought that this guy got drunk and he fell over a cliff in his car. That was what the Chileans were told. And the real story was that he had been tortured and killed before his body was before the car.
John, Marcela, I'm going to open
His body was put in the car.
I'm going to open the floor for some questions.
What the Chileans knew about the case was very partial.
I'm going to open the floor for some questions that we have here. And I think we have a few minutes for questions, maybe 10 minutes or so. Yeah. So, do you want to start?
Hi, John. My name is Jonathan Sanders.
I'm about to run out of. Yeah. Hi.
Working for the Washington Post has advantages and disadvantages. One of the disadvantages is that great American Henry Kissinger read the Washington Post every morning. And I'd like to know, have you seen your own FBI or CIA files to see if they were trying to go after you, to censor you, to put pressure? This guy knows too much. He's telling too many truths.
No, I don't think the CIA or the FBI had any interest in silencing me. But I do have files from DINA, from the Chilean secret police, and definitely they were surveilling me. At one point, they proposed planting cocaine in my luggage so that I would be arrested as a drug trafficker. So yeah, that stuff has been revealed. Luckily, they didn't do it.
Questions in the room? We have one question here. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Christine Kelly. I was just wondering if you could talk about, say, the ongoing current impact of the coup. Obviously, we're still afflicted by, the existence of Henry Kissinger, but say with, the development of, say, I mean, we still have, like, say, the American agencies, including the CIA, getting involved in we'll say like there was the coup in Burkina Faso last year, led by an American soldier. There's some evidence of, say, Niger having U.S. involvement. So I'm just wondering, like, say, is there still, just U.S. involvement in these coups, and what's kind of the legacy now of say the Chilean coup?
Thank you.
Yeah, there's not. I mean, I don't think the CIA is doing the same thing they were doing back in the day. The Church Committee investigation in the when is that? In 1975, 76, really blew the lid off of what the CIA was doing, and I mean, the story of what the CIA has been doing since then is an important story for us all to investigate. But it's very different. For example, in Venezuela, Grenada, in other examples, in Panama, which was a story that I wrote a book about.
Yeah,
so
Panama's incredible.
it was less overt. I mean, it was less covert action and more just overt intervention in those examples.
Yeah, so the same tactics disappear, changed after the church commission, basically.
Yes, and like the stuff that they did in Venezuela that's the closest parallel, where you have actually a CIA, contacts with the opposition people, and part of a failed attempt to overthrow the Maduro government. Very clumsy, and it didn't work. That's the closest parallel to what was happening in the 1970s. I'm about to run out of battery, so before I run out of battery, I want to say thank you to everybody for having me, and I really enjoyed having the conversation with you. Sorry about the technical difficulties, but
Nice to meet you.
I enjoyed. Yeah, nice to meet
Thank you
everybody.
so much. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you, Marcela. Thank you, John.
Yeah.
And we'll be in
Thank
touch.
you.
Thank you so much for being a part of this incredible panel. Thank you so much.
Thanks for
I enjoyed it. Thank you. All right, bye.
Hey, Tom, so I've got a question for you. Maybe you know this, maybe you don't.
Yes.